Imagine a palace with flush toilets and running water, built 3,500 years ago. A civilization so advanced it disappeared from history completely. Nobody knew it existed until 1900, when archaeologists started digging and found golden treasures, mysterious writing, and evidence of a disaster so catastrophic it erased an entire culture. Tonight, the Minoans, Europe's first empire that vanished. March 1900. A British man named Arthur Evans arrives on the island of Crete with a wild theory. He's been collecting ancient seal stones with strange writing nobody can read, and he believes there's a lost civilization buried under the hills of Crete. Most scholars think he's wasting his time. Greek mythology mentions King Minos and a labyrinth with a monster, but that's just stories, right? Fairy tales, nothing real. Evans starts digging at a site called Knossos, just outside the modern city of Heraklion. Within days, his workers hit walls. Not just any walls, painted walls, frescoes showing people, animals, nature scenes. They keep digging. More walls appear, then floors, then staircases, then columns. The team realizes they've found something massive. This isn't a house or a temple. This is a palace. A huge, elaborate, sophisticated palace that's been buried for over 3,000 years. The more they excavate, the more incredible it becomes. This palace covers 6 acres, that's about 4.5 football fields. It has multiple stories, hundreds of rooms, grand ceremonial spaces, storage areas, workshops, living quarters. The architecture is sophisticated, stone columns that taper downward, a design feature that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. Light wells bring sunshine deep into the interior. Sophisticated drainage systems carry away rainwater and sewage. And then Evans finds something that changes everything. Clay tablets covered in writing. 2 different scripts, actually. One he calls Linear A, one he calls Linear B. These aren't just random scratches. These are organized writing systems used for keeping records. This was a literate civilization with bureaucrats, accountants, administrators. This was complex society, not primitive tribes. The frescoes blow everyone's mind. Unlike the stern, formal art of Egypt or the violent war scenes of Assyria, Minoan art is joyful, natural, alive. Dolphins leaping through blue waves, flowers and butterflies, elegant women in elaborate dresses, young people performing acrobatics over charging bulls. The colors are still vivid after 3,500 years, deep blues, bright reds, yellows, greens. It's beautiful art, created by people who clearly loved beauty. Evans keeps finding more. Storage rooms filled with massive clay jars, pithoi, that once held olive oil, wine, grain. These jars are taller than a person, some holding hundreds of gallons. The palace had storage for enormous quantities of food and trade goods. They find bronze tools, stone vessels, fragments of gold jewelry,
Ivory carvings. This was wealth. Serious wealth. The plumbing system particularly amazes archaeologists. The Minoans had running water. Terracotta pipes carried water into the palace. There were bathtubs. There were toilets that flushed with water. There was a sewage system sophisticated enough to handle the waste from hundreds or maybe thousands of people. In 1500 BC, when most of Europe was living in mud huts, the Minoans had indoor plumbing that wouldn't be matched until Roman times, over 1,000 years later. Evans names this civilization Minoan, after the legendary king Minos from Greek mythology. He's connecting the dots. Those old myths about Crete ruling the seas, about King Minos and his palace and his labyrinth. Maybe they weren't just myths. Maybe they were distorted memories of a real civilization that had been completely forgotten. Over the following decades, more Minoan sites are discovered across Crete. Palaces at Phaistos, Malia, Zakros. Villas scattered across the countryside. port towns showing evidence of maritime trade, burial sites with elaborate grave goods. This wasn't just one palace. This was an entire civilization that had flourished for over 6 centuries before vanishing from history. The discovery rewrites European history. Before Evans, scholars thought civilization in Europe began with the Greeks around 800 BC. Suddenly, there's evidence of sophisticated European civilization existing 700 years earlier. The Minoans were building multi-story palaces, developing writing systems, creating elaborate art, and trading across the Mediterranean, while most of Europe was still in the Bronze Age. But the discovery raises enormous questions. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What language did they speak? How did they build such an advanced society? What did they believe? How did they organize their government? And most mysteriously, what happened to them? Why did this remarkable civilization completely disappear, so thoroughly forgotten that even the Greeks who came after them only remembered them as myths? The Linear A script remains undeciphered to this day. Thousands of tablets, and we still can't read them. We know their administrative records, lists of goods, inventory counts, tax records, but the language itself is unknown. Until we decipher Linear A huge part of Minoan civilization remains locked away, secrets written in a code we cannot break. What makes the Minoans even more fascinating is how different they seem from other ancient civilizations. Most Bronze Age societies were militaristic. They built fortifications, glorified warfare, created weapons, conquered neighbors. The Minoans? No defensive walls around their palaces. Art showing nature and celebration, not war and conquest. A culture that seemed to thrive on trade and diplomacy rather than military might. They were unique. The discovery of the Minoans captured public imagination immediately. Here was a lost world, a forgotten civilization, a golden age that nobody had known existed. It was like finding Atlantis, except real. Archaeological teams from around the world descended on Crete. Museums competed for Minoan artifacts. Books were written, theories developed, arguments erupted among scholars. And the mysteries kept multiplying. Those bull-leaping frescoes, what did they mean? Was it sport, religion, both? The prominent images of women in art, did that mean women had high status in Minoan society? The lack of fortifications, were they really that peaceful, or were they just protected by their naval power? Every answer raised new questions. Arthur Evans spent the rest of his life studying the Minoans. He died in 1941, having revolutionized archaeology and added an entire chapter to human history. The Minoans, forgotten for 3,500 years, had been brought back to life. Their palaces, their art, their mysterious writing, their tragic end, all of it preserved for us to study, to wonder about, to learn from. Let's talk about what life was actually like in Minoan Crete at its height, around 1700 to 1450 BC. Because this wasn't just another ancient civilization going through the motions. This was something special. This was as close to paradise as the Bronze Age got. Crete itself was blessed by geography. The island sits in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, roughly equidistant from mainland Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and the Levantine coast. It's at the crossroads of 3 continents. For a trading civilization, you literally couldn't ask for a better location. Every ship traveling between Europe, Asia, and Africa passed near Crete. The Minoans didn't have to go looking for trade. Trade came to them. The island is mountainous, but has fertile valleys perfect for agriculture. The Minoans grew olives and grapes on the hillsides, wheat and barley in the valleys. They raised sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. The Mediterranean climate was ideal. hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. They had everything they needed for a comfortable life, and plenty left over to trade. The palace at Knossos wasn't just a royal residence. It was the economic and administrative heart of a complex society. The central courtyard, massive and open to the sky, was probably used for public gatherings and religious ceremonies. This is where those famous bull-leaping performances likely took place, with crowds gathered to watch young athletes risk their lives performing acrobatics over charging bulls. The residential quarters show how the elite lived. Private apartments with painted walls, windows overlooking courtyards, access to running water. The Queen's Megaron, as archaeologists call it, has walls decorated with dancing dolphins and spiral patterns. There were bathrooms with terracotta bathtubs and toilets connected to the drainage system. Comfort and luxury that kings in other parts of the world could only dream of. But Knossos wasn't isolated. It was the center of a network covering the entire island. Smaller palaces and large villas dotted the countryside, each controlling its own region, but connected to Knossos through trade, administration, and probably family ties. Road networks connected the settlements. Port towns handled maritime trade. It was an organized system, sophisticated and efficient. The Minoans were master craftspeople. Their pottery is instantly recognizable. Thin-walled vessels decorated with flowing, naturalistic designs. Octopi wrapping tentacles around jars. Flowers and plants in stylized patterns. Marine creatures swimming across the surfaces. The pottery wasn't just functional, it was art. Even storage jars were beautiful. They worked bronze with incredible skill, creating weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects. They carved stone vessels from limestone, marble, and exotic stones, sometimes so thin they're almost translucent. They worked gold into intricate jewelry. They created frescoes that still take your breath away 3,500 years later. These people valued beauty, invested time and resources in creating it. Clothing in the frescoes shows a society that was sophisticated and prosperous. Women wear elaborate tiered skirts, tight bodices that leave the breasts exposed, and elaborate hairstyles with curls and braids. Men wear loincloths or kilts, sometimes with elaborate belts. Both sexes wear jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, rings. This is wealth on display, fashion as status symbol. The economy was impressive. The storage magazines at Knossos could hold over 400,000 liters of olive oil. That's over 100,000 gallons. This wasn't for local consumption. This was export trade on an industrial scale. They were producing olive oil and wine in massive quantities, storing it in those enormous pithoi, and shipping it across the Mediterranean. We know from Egyptian tomb paintings that Minoans traveled to Egypt with trade goods. The Egyptians called Crete Keftiu and depicted Minoan traders bringing gifts to the pharaoh: fine pottery, bronze weapons, elaborate textiles. This wasn't just trade. This was diplomatic exchange between equals. The Minoans were important enough that Egyptian pharaohs wanted their friendship. Minoan ships carried copper from Cyprus, purple dye from the Levantine coast, ivory from Africa, amber from northern Europe, tin from somewhere far away, Afghanistan or Cornwall or both. They were the middlemen of the Mediterranean, and middlemen always make the best profit. They didn't just transport goods, they added value, processing raw materials into finished products and selling them at markup. Religion was central to Minoan life, though we don't fully understand it. Bulls were clearly sacred. The bull-leaping ceremonies weren't just sport, they were religious ritual. Snake goddesses or priestesses appear in figurines, women holding snakes, wearing elaborate costumes, breasts exposed. There's strong evidence for worship of a mother goddess, a powerful female deity associated with fertility and nature. Religious ceremonies took place in palace shrines and in natural settings. Cave sanctuaries show evidence of ritual offerings. Mountaintop sanctuaries suggest they worshipped in high places. The Minoans seemed to see divinity in nature itself, in mountains and caves, in bulls and snakes, in the sea that surrounded and sustained them. What's remarkable is the apparent lack of militarism. Other Bronze Age civilizations glorified warfare. Egyptian art shows pharaohs smiting enemies. Mesopotamian art depicts conquering kings. Mycenaean art celebrates warriors and weapons. Minoan art? Dolphins and flowers. Nature and celebration. Yes, there are weapons. They needed them for hunting and defense. But warfare isn't celebrated, isn't central to their cultural identity. The lack of fortification walls is telling. The Mycenaeans built walls so massive that later Greeks thought giants must have built them. Hittite cities had elaborate fortifications. Egyptian cities had walls. But Minoan palaces? Open to the world. This suggests either remarkable confidence or a different kind of power. Naval power. The Minoans controlled the sea, and that was their defense. Any enemy trying to invade would have to cross water controlled by the Minoan fleet. This created a unique culture, outward-looking, confident, engaged with the wider world. The Minoans weren't paranoid about invasion because they were the dominant naval power. They didn't need walls because their ships were their walls. It's the same strategy that later made Britain and Venice powerful. Control the sea, and islands become fortresses. Social structure is harder to understand without reading their texts, but we can make inferences. The palaces were clearly administrative centers, with bureaucrats tracking economic activity. The clay tablets show obsessive record-keeping. Every jar of oil, every sheep, every bronze tool was counted and tracked. This was a managed economy with central control. But Minoan society seems less hierarchical than other Bronze Age cultures. Women appear prominently in art, often in positions suggesting high status. Some scholars argue Minoan society might have been matriarchal, or at least gave women more rights than other ancient societies. That's debated, but the prominence of female figures in religion and art is undeniable. Life for common people was probably pretty good by Bronze Age standards. Yes, they worked hard, farming, fishing, crafting, trading, but they lived in a prosperous society, one that valued beauty and seemed relatively peaceful. They weren't being marched off to constant wars. They weren't building monuments to glorify warrior kings. They were living, trading, creating, celebrating. This was the Minoan Golden Age. 6 centuries of prosperity, cultural achievement, and peace. A civilization that seemed to have figured out how to thrive without conquest, how to grow rich through trade rather than tribute from conquered peoples. It was remarkable. It was unique. And it was about to end in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Now we come to one of the most iconic and mysterious aspects of Minoan culture, the bull leaping. Because when you look at those frescoes at Knossos showing young people performing acrobatics over charging bulls, you have to ask, what were they thinking? This is dangerous. Bulls are massive, powerful animals that can kill you with a toss of their head. So why do it? The frescoes show the technique clearly. A bull charges. A young person, could be male or female, the Minoans didn't seem to discriminate, runs toward the bull head-on. At the last second, they grab the bull's horns. The bull tosses its head upward, flinging the person into the air. Mid-flight, they perform a somersault, landing on the bull's back. From there, they either dismount to the side, or another somersault carries them to the ground behind the bull, where a teammate waits to catch them. This isn't metaphorical. Archaeological evidence suggests people really did this. We found bones of young people with injuries consistent with bull leaping accidents, fractures, trauma, deadly injuries. This was real, it was dangerous, and people died doing it. So why? What could possibly motivate someone to risk their life this way? Religion is the most likely answer. Bulls were sacred to the Minoans. That's clear from the art. Bull imagery appears everywhere. The famous bull's head reten, a ceremonial vessel in the shape of a bull's head, is a masterpiece of ancient art, crafted from black steatite with crystal eyes and golden horns. This wasn't just decoration. The bull represented something deeply important to Minoan spirituality. In many ancient cultures, bulls symbolized strength, fertility, and divine power. The bull leaping might have been a religious ritual where young people confronted the power of the sacred bull, demonstrating courage and skill as an offering to the gods. Successfully completing the leap proved you were worthy, blessed by the gods, ready to take your place as a full member of society. It might have been an initiation rite. Young people coming of age had to prove themselves by facing the bull. Success meant adulthood, status, respect. Failure meant injury or death, but also eternal shame. High stakes create powerful social bonds. Everyone who survived bull leaping shared an experience that set them apart, created an elite group bound by shared risk and survival. Or maybe it was political theatre. The Minoans controlled a maritime empire. Subject cities on Crete, and perhaps on other islands, paid tribute to Knossos. The bull leaping might have been how they demonstrated submission. You want to rebel? Fine. Send your best young people to leap our sacred bulls. If they survive, we'll talk. It's tribute disguised as religious ceremony, control masked as spiritual ritual. The central courtyard at Knossos, that massive open space in the middle of the palace, was probably where bull leaping took place. Imagine crowds gathered, filling the porticos around the courtyard, watching these incredible displays of courage and athleticism. The atmosphere would have been electric, cheering, gasping, praying. Part religious ceremony, part sporting event, part political demonstration. Everything happening at once. The young people performing were probably special, chosen, trained, perhaps from elite families or perhaps from subject cities. The training would have taken years. You don't just walk up to a bull and somersault over it. You need strength, agility, timing, courage. The bull leapers were athletes at the peak of human performance, like Olympic gymnasts or Formula One drivers today. But beyond the bull leaping, what did the Minoans believe? That's frustratingly unclear. Without reading Linear A, we're missing their religious texts, their myths, their explanations of the cosmos and humanity's place in it. We have to infer from art and architecture, which is like trying to understand Christianity by looking only at cathedral architecture and religious paintings, without reading the Bible. Female deities seem central. The famous snake goddess figurines show women wearing elaborate tiered skirts and tall hats, holding snakes in outstretched hands, breasts exposed. Are these priestesses or goddesses themselves? We don't know. But the prominence of these figures suggests goddess worship, probably a mother goddess associated with fertility, nature, and the earth. Snakes in ancient religions often symbolize rebirth and renewal because they shed their skin.
They also symbolize earth and underworld, living in holes in the ground. The snake goddess might represent the power of the earth itself, the source of crops and life. Worshipping her would ensure fertility of fields, animals, and people. Natural settings were sacred. Cave sanctuaries across Crete show evidence of ritual activity, offerings of bronze figurines, pottery, food. Stalactites in some caves were treated as sacred objects, offerings placed around them. The Minoans saw divinity in the earth itself, in the caves that penetrated deep into the living rock. Mountain peaks were also sacred. Peak sanctuaries on high mountains show evidence of ritual fires, offering tables, figurines left as votives. The Minoans climbed mountains to get closer to the divine, to pray in places where earth met sky. These weren't temples built by humans. These were natural, sacred spaces where the gods were present. Ritual objects found at palace sites include offering tables with channels for liquids, probably wine or blood for libations, horns of consecration, stylized bull horns made of stone, marked sacred spaces. Double axes, the labyrinth symbol, appear in religious contexts. Some scholars think this is where the word labyrinth comes from. Sacred pillars in palace shrines might have represented the presence of deity. One puzzling site is Anemaspilia, where archaeologists found what might be evidence of human sacrifice. A building destroyed by earthquake contained the bodies of 4 people, including what appears to be a young man on an altar with a bronze knife beside him. This is controversial. Was this sacrifice, or just people who died when the earthquake hit? The debate continues. If the Minoans did practice human sacrifice, it might have been rare, done in times of extreme crisis, like when earthquakes kept hitting, when crops failed, when the gods seemed angry. Desperate people do desperate things to appease angry gods. But we can't be sure. The evidence is ambiguous. What's clear is that religion permeated Minoan life. This wasn't something you did for an hour on the weekend. Religious festivals, rituals, offerings, ceremonies, they were woven into daily life. The palace itself was religious space as much as administrative center. The ruler was probably also religious leader, or closely connected to religious authority. The bull leaping brings all this together. It's athletic performance, religious ritual, political theater, social bonding, and probably entertainment all at once. It's impossible for modern minds to fully grasp because we separate these things. Sports are separate from religion. Politics are separate from athletics. But for the Minoans, everything connected. And here's what really gets me. They did this for centuries. Generation after generation of young people trained to leap bulls, risking their lives in the central courtyard while crowds watched and prayed. Centuries of tradition, religious practice, cultural identity, all centered on this incredible act of courage and faith. It defined them. It was who they were. When Minoan civilization fell, bull leaping ended. The practice died with the culture. Later Greeks remembered it only as myth, the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster in the labyrinth. A real religious practice, transformed by time and cultural distance into a monster story. But for the Minoans, it was sacred. It was the moment when human courage met divine power, where mortality confronted the eternal, where young people proved their worth in the most dangerous way imaginable. The Minoans didn't become the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean by accident. They built an empire on ships, trade routes, and economic connections that stretched across 3 continents. This was the first true maritime empire in European history.
and understanding how they did it tells us everything about who they were. First, let's talk about the ships. We don't have intact Minoan ships. Wood doesn't survive 3,500 years underwater very well. But we have pictures of ships on seals and frescoes, and we have amphoras and other trade goods found in shipwrecks. From these, we can reconstruct what Minoan vessels probably looked like. They were sailing ships, mostly, though they might have had oars for maneuvering in harbors and calm conditions. The hulls were probably built with planks edge-joined and pegged together, then reinforced with frames. Solid construction that could handle open water. These weren't little fishing boats. These were cargo vessels, capable of carrying tons of goods across hundreds of miles of Mediterranean Sea. Navigation in the Bronze Age was sophisticated but challenging. No GPS, no charts, no compass. Sailors navigated by landmarks along the coast, by the position of stars at night, by winds and currents they'd memorized from experience. Knowledge was passed down from master to apprentice, from father to son. You didn't learn to sail by reading a book. You learned by doing, by sailing with experienced crews until you knew the routes yourself. The Mediterranean is treacherous. Sudden storms can appear out of nowhere. Winter sailing was especially dangerous, with rough seas and unpredictable weather. Most ancient Mediterranean trade happened in summer months, when seas were calmer. The Minoans probably had a sailing season, spring through fall, then waited out winter in port. But the rewards made the risks worthwhile. A ship full of olive oil from Crete could sell in Egypt for many times what it cost to produce. Bring back Egyptian grain, papyrus, and gold, sell them on Crete or in Anatolia, and profits multiplied again. A successful merchant could get wealthy from a few good voyages. A merchant family could build fortunes over generations. Crete's location was perfect for this trade. Right in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, roughly equidistant from major markets. Ships traveling from Greece to Egypt passed near Crete. Ships going from Anatolia to North Africa passed near Crete. Ships traveling from the Levant to the western Mediterranean passed near Crete. The Minoans didn't have to sail far to intercept trade. Trade came to them. The port towns were crucial. Knossos, on Crete's southern coast, shows evidence of massive harbour facilities, storage buildings, workshops, ship sheds. This was infrastructure built to handle volume trade. Ships arrived, cargo was unloaded, goods were stored and processed, then loaded onto other ships for different destinations. The Minoans were running a sophisticated logistics operation. And they didn't just transport goods. They added value. Raw materials came to Crete, got processed into finished products, then sold at premium prices. Copper ore arrived from Cyprus, got smelted and worked into bronze tools and weapons in Minoan workshops, then exported. Wool came in, got woven into fine textiles with Minoan dyes and patterns, then sold. This is how you maximize profit. Don't just move stuff, transform it. The palace storerooms show the scale of this operation. Those massive pithoi holding 400,000 litres of olive oil? That's export goods waiting for ships. The Linear B tablets from Knossos track inventory obsessively. What came in, what went out, what's stored where. This was warehouse management 3,500 years ago. Sophisticated enough that it wouldn't look unfamiliar to a modern logistics manager. What did they trade? Olive oil and wine, definitely. Crete produced both in surplus. Pottery. Minoan pottery was prized for its beauty and quality, found across the Mediterranean. Textiles. Fine fabrics dyed with expensive purple from murex shells. Metalwork. Bronze weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects. possibly timber. Crete had forests, and wood was valuable in tree-scarce Egypt. In return, they imported copper and tin for bronze making. Copper from Cyprus, tin from unknown sources, probably Afghanistan or Cornwall or both. Gold and silver for jewelry and wealth storage. Grain from Egypt. Crete produced food, but probably not enough for its population. Luxury goods. Ivory from Africa. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Amber from the Baltic. Anything rare and valuable, the Minoans traded in it. They also traded ideas and technology. Minoan art influenced Egyptian art. You can see Minoan-style frescoes in Egyptian tombs. Minoan pottery appears in the Levant and shows up in local pottery styles. Minoan architectural techniques spread across the Aegean. Cultural exchange traveled along trade routes, ideas hitchhiking with cargo. The Minoans had relationships with all the major powers. Egypt knew them well. Egyptian records mention Keftiu, Crete, regularly. The Hittites in Anatolia probably traded with them. The Mycenaeans on mainland Greece certainly did, and probably learned their maritime skills from Minoan teachers. The city-states of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, all traded with Crete. This created a network effect. The Minoans weren't just one node in a trade network. They were a central hub. Information flowed through them. Goods from Egypt could reach Anatolia through Minoan middlemen. Copper from Cyprus could get to Greece via Crete. The Minoans knew what was happening everywhere because their merchants went everywhere and reported back. This information was valuable. Knowing that grain prices were high in Anatolia but low in Egypt meant profit opportunity. Buy low, sell high. Knowing that Cyprus had new copper finds meant negotiating better prices before others knew. Knowing that political instability was disrupting trade routes meant finding alternatives. Information was power, and the Minoans had it. Naval power backed this up. The Minoans probably had a fleet capable of protecting their merchant ships from pirates and enforcing their control over key routes. We don't know details. No battle records survive. But you don't dominate Mediterranean trade without the ability to protect your ships and intimidate competitors. This is why Minoan palaces didn't have defensive walls. Their defense was their fleet. Any enemy trying to invade Crete would have to cross 70 miles of open water, and the Minoan navy would intercept them. As long as they controlled the sea, the island was safe. It's the same logic Britain used much later. An island protected by naval power doesn't need walls. The Minoans created what historians call a thalassocracy, rule by sea power. Not a land empire with armies conquering territories, but a maritime network of trade and influence. They controlled through economic connections, through being indispensable middlemen, through making others depend on their trade. It's soft power before that term existed. This made them wealthy beyond measure. The gold, silver, and precious goods found in palace ruins are just a fraction of what they once had. Most was looted or melted down long ago. But what survives shows incredible wealth. Elaborate gold jewelry, silver vessels, bronze works of art. The Minoans were rich, and they spent their wealth on beautiful things. But here's the vulnerability. Their entire system depended on stable trade networks, on being able to sail safely, on other civilizations being willing to trade. When those conditions disappeared, when catastrophe disrupted trade, when competition emerged, when the system broke, the Minoan economy would collapse. Because they'd built everything on being the middlemen. Take away the trade, and what's left? Here's one of the most frustrating things in archaeology. We have thousands of Minoan documents. We can hold them in our hands. We can see the writing clearly. and we cannot read most of them. It's like finding someone's diary, written in perfect handwriting, in a language that no longer exists. The Minoans used two different writing systems. The earlier one, appearing around 1800 BC, is called Linear A. It's found on clay tablets, mostly at palace sites, and on some pottery and stone objects. We have about 1,400 Linear A inscriptions total. Not a huge amount, but enough that you'd think someone could figure it out. Scholars have been trying since the early 1900s. No luck. The problem is fundamental. We don't know what language Linear A represents. The script itself is clear enough. About 90 different symbols, a mix of phonetic signs, representing sounds, and ideograms, representing whole words or concepts. But a script is just a writing system. You also need to know the language. When Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B in 1952, he figured out that it was an early form of Greek. Once he knew the language, he could work out what the symbols meant. But Linear A? Not Greek. Probably not any Indo-European language. Maybe something related to languages from Anatolia. Maybe something completely unique that died when Minoan civilization fell and has no living descendants. Some partial progress has been made. Numbers are clear. The Minoans used a decimal system, and we can read the numerical values. Some words appear to be titles or names, ruler or priestess perhaps, though we're guessing based on context. Lists of goods can sometimes be identified by ideograms showing sheep, wheat, olive oil. But the actual language? The grammar, the vocabulary, the meaning of most words? Unknown. This is incredibly frustrating, because we know these tablets contain valuable information. They're administrative records from the palaces, inventory lists, tax records, work assignments, probably some legal documents and religious texts. If we could read them, we'd know so much more. We'd know the Minoan language. We'd know their religion better. We'd know how their society was organized, what they valued, how they thought. Some tablets tantalize us with hints. There are what appear to be lists of offerings to various deities. If we could read the deity names, we'd know Minoan religious beliefs much better. There are tablets that seem to record legal transactions. There are tablets that might be literary or religious texts, not just bureaucratic lists, all locked away in a code we can't crack. Scholars keep trying. They use computer analysis, statistical methods, comparison with known languages, comparison with Linear B. Some claim breakthroughs. I've deciphered Linear A. But none convince the wider academic community. The tablets keep their secrets. Then there's Linear B, which appears around 1450 BC and is found at Knossos and at Mycenaean sites on mainland Greece. Linear B was a mystery until 1952, when Michael Ventris, a British architect and part-time linguist, achieved one of the great intellectual breakthroughs of the 20th century. Ventris realized that Linear B was Greek. Early Greek, archaic Greek, but Greek. This was revolutionary because it pushed literate Greek civilization back 500 years earlier than anyone had thought. Suddenly, scholars could read administrative records from Mycenaean palaces. They learned about Mycenaean economy, society, religion. The tablets mentioned gods that appear in later Greek mythology: Zeus, Poseidon, Athena. They showed a complex bureaucratic system tracking everything. But here's what's important for our story. Linear B tablets at Knossos prove that the palace was being run by Greek speakers. The Mycenaeans had taken over. They adapted the Minoan Linear A script to write their own language, creating Linear B. The palace was still functioning, but new management was in charge. What happened to the Minoan language? It probably continued to be spoken by common people for a while,
but it stopped being written. It was no longer the language of power and administration. Over generations, Greek became dominant, and the old Minoan language faded away. By classical Greek times, nobody remembered it had ever existed. This is a common pattern when one culture conquers another. The conqueror's language replaces the conquered people's language, especially in official contexts. Latin replaced Gaulish in France. Spanish replaced indigenous languages in the Americas. English replaced Native American languages in North America. Languages die when they stop being useful for advancement. The clay tablets survived by accident. They weren't meant to be permanent. In ancient palace bureaucracies, clay tablets were like
our sticky notes or scratch paper, temporary records. You'd write inventory for the year on clay tablets, transfer the important information to more permanent records, probably papyrus or parchment, then recycle the clay and make new tablets next year. But when palaces burned, and many of them did violently, the fire baked the clay tablets, turning them from soft, temporary records into hard, permanent ceramics. Disaster preserved what normal circumstances would have destroyed. The fires that ended Minoan civilization also preserved their last written words. Think about what we've lost. The tablets that survived are mundane administrative stuff, but the Minoans must have had literature, poetry, history, religious texts, philosophical writings, technical manuals, legal codes. Those would have been written on perishable materials: papyrus, parchment, wood, maybe even paper made from plant fibers. All of it rotted away thousands of years ago. It's like if future archaeologists studied our civilization but only found tax records and inventory databases. They could reconstruct our economy, but would miss our literature, our philosophy, our culture. That's our situation with the Minoans. We have their receipts. We're missing their stories. What would Linear A tell us if we could read it? We'd know what the Minoans called themselves. We don't know that. Minoan is a modern name based on Greek mythology. We'd know their gods' names, their myths, their religious beliefs. We'd understand their social structure better, who had power, how it was distributed, what mattered to them. We'd know if they were as peaceful as their art suggests, or if that's a misleading impression. We'd know about their relationships with other powers. Were they equals to Egypt or junior partners? Did they pay tribute to anyone, or was everyone paying tribute to them? We'd understand the palace economy better. Was it oppressive or relatively fair? What did common people think about their rulers? We'd hear their voices. That's what really frustrates scholars. The Minoans wrote down their thoughts, their beliefs, their records of events. Those words still exist on clay tablets we can touch, but we can't hear them. It's like listening to someone speaking through soundproof glass. You see their mouth moving, see them gesturing, but can't make out the words. Some scholars think Linear A will eventually be deciphered. New tablets are still being found. Just a few years ago, several new inscriptions were discovered. Computer analysis keeps improving. Maybe someone will have a breakthrough, like Ventris did with Linear B. Maybe we'll finally crack the code. Until then, Linear A remains one of archaeology's great unsolved mysteries. The Minoan language is dead, but not entirely gone. It's locked in these tablets, waiting for someone smart enough or lucky enough to find the key. The Minoans left us a message. We just need to learn how to read it. Now we come to the catastrophe that changed everything. One of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history, an event so devastating that it might have destroyed Minoan civilization, or at least crippled it so badly that it never recovered.
This is the Thera eruption, and it was apocalyptic. 70 miles north of Crete sits the island of Santorini, called Thera in ancient times. Today it's a beautiful tourist destination with whitewashed buildings perched on cliffs surrounding a deep blue bay. Tourists take photos of the stunning sunsets, swim in the volcanic beaches, drink wine at cliffside restaurants. What they don't realize is that they're standing inside a volcano. That beautiful bay? It's actually a caldera, a giant crater formed when the center of the island literally exploded. And around 1600 BC, the exact date is debated, but roughly 3,600 years ago, that volcano erupted with a force that almost defies comprehension. Let me give you perspective. Mount St. Helens in 1980 was big. It devastated 230 square miles and ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. People remember it as a massive disaster. The Krakatoa eruption in 1883 was bigger. It killed tens of thousands and was heard 3,000 miles away. The Thera eruption was bigger than both. It ejected at least 40 cubic kilometers of material, 40 times more than Mount St. Helens. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The immediate effects on Thera itself were total annihilation. The center of the island disappeared. Where there had been a volcanic mountain, there was suddenly a giant hole, a caldera over 7 miles across. Everything on the island was buried under dozens of feet of volcanic ash and pumice. Every building, every tree, every living thing, gone. Archaeologists have excavated Akrotiri, a Minoan town on Thera that was buried like Pompeii. The preservation is incredible. Buildings stand 2 and 3 stories high, frescoes still vivid on walls, pottery intact in storage rooms. But unlike Pompeii, there are no bodies, no human remains, no animal skeletons. The people had warning and evacuated. The warning was probably earthquakes. Major eruptions are typically preceded by earthquake swarms as magma moves underground. The people of Akrotiri felt the ground shaking, saw smaller eruptions perhaps, and made the smart decision to leave. They saved their lives, but lost everything else. Their homes, their possessions, their entire town, all buried forever. But what about Crete, 70 miles away? The effects there would have been catastrophic, though differently than on Thera itself. First came the ashfall. When a volcano erupts that violently, it shoots a column of ash and rock high into the stratosphere. The column from Thera might have reached 20 miles high. Then the ash spreads out, carried by high-altitude winds, and starts falling. Eastern Crete, downwind from Thera, would have been buried in volcanic ash. Maybe a few inches, maybe more in some places. That doesn't sound like much, but volcanic ash isn't like regular dust. It's made of tiny shards of volcanic glass. It's abrasive, toxic, and doesn't wash away with rain. It has to be manually cleared. Fields covered in volcanic ash become sterile. The ash has to be removed before you can farm again, and that's labor-intensive, difficult work. Animals that eat ash-contaminated vegetation get sick and die. Water sources become polluted. Breathing air full of ash causes respiratory problems. For an agricultural society, this is an economic disaster. The ashfall might have lasted days. The sky would have darkened, not completely black like night, but dim and gray, with ash falling like toxic snow. The psychological impact would have been immense. The sun disappearing, the sky raining ash, the ground shaking from the eruption. It would have seemed like the end of the world. Then came the tsunamis. When that much rock suddenly evacuates from a volcanic chamber, the ocean rushes in to fill the void. Then it rushes back out. Massive waves radiate from the eruption site in all directions. By the time the tsunamis reached Crete, they would have grown to terrifying size. Estimates range from 30 to 100 feet high. Wall of water traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. There would have been no warning, no time to evacuate. Coastal settlements would have been obliterated in minutes. Crete's northern coast, facing Thera, would have been hit first and hardest. Port towns, harbors, ships, all swept away. The Minoan fleet, the source of their power, might have been destroyed in minutes. Warehouses full of trade goods, workshops near harbors, homes along the coast, all washed inland or dragged out to sea. The tsunamis wouldn't have stopped after one wave. When water displaced by a volcanic eruption returns, it creates multiple waves. 3, 5, maybe 7 separate tsunamis might have hit Crete over several hours. Survivors of the first wave might have been caught by subsequent waves. Each one would have scoured the coastline again. The death toll would have been enormous. Thousands, probably tens of thousands killed directly. Many more injured, homeless, traumatized. Coastal settlements were where most people lived in a maritime civilization. That's where the harbors, markets, workshops were. The tsunami would have hit the economic heart of Minoan Crete. But the effects didn't stop there. Volcanic eruptions affect global climate. The massive amount of ash and especially sulfur dioxide ejected into the stratosphere would have circled the globe, blocking sunlight. Temperatures worldwide would have dropped for several years. Growing seasons would have shortened. Crops would have failed, not just on Crete, but across the Mediterranean and beyond. We have evidence for this. Tree rings from ancient trees show abnormal growth patterns around 1600 BC, narrow rings indicating poor growing conditions. Ice cores from Greenland show volcanic ash deposits. Egyptian records might reference strange events, darkness, crop failures, though the chronology is uncertain. For the Minoans, this was a perfect storm of disasters. Immediate destruction from ash and tsunamis, agricultural collapse from ash-covered fields, long-term climate impacts causing crop failures for years, disruption of trade networks as other regions dealt with their own climate-induced problems. The economic foundation of Minoan civilization would have collapsed, and psychologically, this might have been even more devastating. The Minoans worshipped nature gods. They depended on the sea. When nature turned against them so violently, what did that mean? Were the gods angry? Had they violated some sacred law? The religious and psychological crisis might have been as damaging as the physical destruction. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The dating of the eruption is uncertain. Radiocarbon dating suggests around 1600 BC, but the archaeological evidence of major Minoan decline suggests around 1450 BC. That's a 150-year gap. So did the eruption directly destroy Minoan civilization? Or did it weaken them, and they lingered for another century or two before finally collapsing? Some scholars think there were two separate disasters. The eruption around 1600 BC that damaged but didn't destroy Minoan civilization, then something else around 1450 BC, maybe Mycenaean invasion, maybe internal collapse, maybe another disaster, that finished them off. Others think the dating is wrong and the eruption was actually closer to 1500 BC. What we know for certain, Thera erupted violently. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history.
It would have severely affected Crete, and not long after, in archaeological terms, Minoan civilization collapsed. The exact causal chain is debated, but the correlation is clear. Imagine living through this as a Minoan. One morning, the ground starts shaking, harder than usual, more persistent. Then the sky to the north lights up with fire. A massive column of smoke and ash rises into the sky, spreading out like a mushroom cloud. The sky darkens. Ash starts falling. The shaking continues, relentless. Then you're at the coast, and you see it, the water pulling back, farther than you've ever seen, exposing the sea floor. And then you see the wave coming. A wall of water impossibly tall, moving impossibly fast. There's no time to run. The wave hits, and everything disappears. For those who survived, the world has ended. Your family might be dead, your home is destroyed, your city is rubble and mud. The fields are buried in ash, the ships are gone, the palaces are damaged, and the sky is still dark with ash, and the ground is still shaking, and you don't know if the gods will ever stop being angry. This is what the Minoans faced. This is the catastrophe that might have destroyed them, or at least wounded them so badly that they never recovered their former glory. The golden age was ending. The darkness was
beginning. While the Minoans were recovering, or trying to recover, from the volcanic catastrophe, another power was watching from across the sea. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece had been learning from the Minoans for generations, adopting their art, copying their technology, envying their wealth. Now they saw opportunity. The greatest maritime power in the Mediterranean was wounded, and the Mycenaeans moved in. The Mycenaeans were different from the Minoans in fundamental ways. Where Minoan art showed dolphins and flowers, Mycenaean art showed warriors and weapons. Where Minoan palaces had no defensive walls, Mycenaean citadels were surrounded by massive fortifications. Where the Minoans seemed to prefer trade and diplomacy, the Mycenaeans were comfortable with warfare and conquest. They were warriors, and they saw a weakened civilization ripe for taking. Around 1450 BC, whether that's shortly after the eruption or a century and a half later depending on dating, the Mycenaeans took control of Crete. We know this happened because the language changes. The Linear B tablets from Knossos after this date are in Greek. Greek-speaking administrators were running the palace. The Minoans were no longer in charge of their own civilization. How did this happen? The tablets don't tell us. We don't have battle reports or conquest narratives, but we can make informed guesses based on archaeological evidence. Some sites on Crete show destruction layers from this period, burned buildings, violently destroyed settlements. This suggests warfare, conquest, resistance being crushed. The Mycenaeans might have invaded with military force, their warrior culture overwhelming a weakened Minoan society that had never been particularly militaristic. Or maybe it was more gradual. Perhaps the Minoans, struggling after the volcanic disaster, hired Mycenaean mercenaries for protection. Maybe there was intermarriage between Mycenaean warriors and Minoan elite families. Maybe Mycenaean merchants established colonies that gradually gained power, and eventually the Mycenaeans just took over. Not through one dramatic invasion, but through slow infiltration until they controlled everything. Or maybe there was civil unrest on Crete. The volcanic disaster would have been economically devastating. Trade disrupted, agriculture damaged, wealth destroyed. Maybe there were food shortages,
maybe the central government lost control. Maybe different regions or cities fought each other for remaining resources. The Mycenaeans might have arrived as the island was tearing itself apart and simply picked up the pieces. However it happened, the result was clear. Knossos was now a Mycenaean administrative center. The palace still functioned, but it served different masters, and those masters had different values. The art changes. Later frescoes at Knossos show warriors, chariots, weapons, hunting scenes, things rarely seen in earlier Minoan art. This is Mycenaean aesthetic imposing itself. The peaceful dolphins and flowers are being replaced by images of power and violence. It's cultural transformation through conquest. The language changes. Linear B replaces Linear A. Greek replaces whatever the Minoans spoke. This isn't just administrative convenience. This is cultural erasure. When a language stops being written, when it's no longer the language of power and commerce and law, it begins to die. Minoan language probably continued to be spoken by common people for a while, but without official status, without education in it, it faded away. The religion changes. The Mycenaeans brought their own gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, gods we know from later Greek mythology. They're mentioned on Linear B tablets from Knossos. The Minoan mother goddess, the snake priestesses, the bull worship, these probably continued in modified form, merged with Mycenaean beliefs, but the pure Minoan religious tradition was ending. For the Minoan people, this must have been devastating. Their civilization, already wounded by natural disaster, was now being taken over by foreigners. Their language was being replaced. Their culture was being transformed. Their identity was being erased. The free, sophisticated, wealthy society that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries was becoming a province in someone else's empire. But here's something interesting. Minoan culture didn't disappear entirely. It merged with Mycenaean culture, creating something new. The Mycenaeans didn't just conquer and destroy. They absorbed and adapted. They kept the palace administrative systems. They adopted artistic techniques. They continued some religious practices. Later Greek civilization, which descended from the Mycenaeans, inherited elements from both cultures. The Mycenaean period on Crete lasted about 200 years, roughly 1450 to 1200 BC. Knossos continued as a major administrative center. Other sites show mixed Minoan-Mycenaean culture. Trade continued, though probably not at earlier levels. The island was still inhabited, still economically important, just no longer the center of a great civilization. Then, around 1200 BC, everything fell apart again. This is the Bronze Age collapse, that mysterious period when civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously collapsed. The Mycenaean palaces on mainland Greece were destroyed. The Hittite Empire vanished. Egypt barely survived. Trade networks broke down. Writing disappeared in Greece for 400 years. Knossos burned around this time. Unlike earlier destructions, it wasn't rebuilt. The palace that had stood for over 1,000 years, that had been the center of Minoan and then Mycenaean power on Crete, was abandoned. People dispersed to smaller settlements. The bureaucratic system collapsed. The Bronze Age ended, and the Iron Age began. Crete entered a dark age. Settlements were smaller, poorer, more isolated. No more palaces, no more elaborate art, no more writing. Life continued, people still
Farmed, raised animals, fished. But the sophistication was gone. The glory days were over, and the Minoans were forgotten. Not gradually, not partially, completely forgotten. The classical Greeks who emerged centuries later had no idea the Minoans had existed. They saw ruins on Crete and made up stories about them. The palace at Knossos became the legendary labyrinth of King Minos.
The Minoan civilization became the myth of the Minotaur. This is one of the strangest things about the Minoan story. This wasn't a minor culture that disappeared, leaving no trace. This was a major civilization that dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. They traded with Egypt, influenced Mycenaean Greece, built incredible palaces, created beautiful art. How do you completely forget something that important? Part of it is the collapse being so complete. When the palaces burned and weren't rebuilt, when the writing stopped and wasn't taught, when the trade networks broke and weren't restored, there was no continuity. The thread of cultural memory was severed. Later Greeks remembered that Crete had once been important, but the details were lost. Part of it is the Mycenaeans replacing Minoan culture. The conqueror's story becomes the official story. Minoan achievements got attributed to Mycenaeans or forgotten entirely. It's historical erasure through conquest and cultural replacement. And part of it is just time. 3,500 years is a long time. Memories fade, records are lost, buildings crumble, languages die. Without written records being copied and preserved, without continuous occupation maintaining knowledge, the past disappears. The Minoans became ghosts, invisible presences haunting Greek mythology. King Minos, the wise lawgiver, became a mythical tyrant. The sophisticated palace became a monster's lair. The bull-leaping ceremonies became the Minotaur. Real history transformed into legend, and eventually, even the legends became uncertain. For over 3,000 years, that's all the Minoans were. Myths, legends, stories whose truth nobody could verify. The actual Minoans, their history, their achievements, their culture, all gone, forgotten, lost to time. Until Arthur Evans started digging and brought them back into the light. The Minoans were gone, but they weren't entirely forgotten. Greek mythology preserved distorted memories of Cretan power, transforming history into legend. These myths are our connection to the Minoan past, garbled and exaggerated, but containing truth. Let's talk about what the myths tell us and what they hide. The most famous myth is the Minotaur. King Minos of Crete offended the god Poseidon, who cursed Minos' wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with a sacred bull. She had the craftsman Daedalus build a wooden cow costume, climbed inside, and the result was the Minotaur, a monster with a bull's head and human body. Ashamed, Minos had Daedalus construct an elaborate labyrinth beneath his palace to imprison the monster. Athens, having lost a war to Crete, was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women every 9 years as tribute, food for the Minotaur. This continued until the Athenian hero Theseus volunteered, entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and escaped using a thread given to him by Minos' daughter Ariadne, who had fallen in love with him. What's real in this myth? Let's unpack it. The bull is obviously connected to Minoan bull worship. We know bulls were sacred, central to Minoan religion, used in those dangerous bull-leaping ceremonies. The image of a bull-headed creature might be a memory of priests or priestesses wearing bull masks during rituals. Or it might represent the bull itself as a divine being. The labyrinth makes sense when you see Knossos. The palace is a maze, hundreds of rooms connected by corridors that turn and double back, with no obvious organization to outsiders. Later Greeks, seeing these ruins, might have imagined them as deliberately designed to confuse. The word labyrinth might even come from labris, the double axe symbol that appears throughout Minoan religion. The tribute of youths for the Minotaur is darker.
Did Minoans demand human sacrifice from subject cities? The evidence is unclear. There's that controversial site at Animaspilia with possible sacrifice victims, but it's debated. More likely, the myth preserves a memory of political dominance. Crete, forcing mainland Greek cities to send tribute, maybe including young people for bull-leaping ceremonies, which were genuinely dangerous. Or maybe it's metaphorical. The tribute might represent economic dominance. Greek cities had to trade with Crete, had to pay for access to Minoan trade networks, were economically subordinate. That dependence gets mythologized as young people being devoured by a monster. Theseus killing the Minotaur probably represents the Mycenaean conquest of Crete. The Mycenaeans overthrew Minoan dominance, taking control of the island. This victory gets transformed into a hero slaying a monster. The monster isn't literally real, it's Minoan power itself, now destroyed and relegated to myth. Ariadne's thread is fascinating symbolically. She gives Theseus a ball of thread so he can find his way out of the labyrinth after killing the Minotaur. This might represent the Mycenaeans learning Minoan knowledge, their bureaucratic systems, their trade networks, their maritime skills. The thread is the key to understanding and mastering Minoan civilization. Daedalus, the legendary architect who built the labyrinth, probably represents Minoan technological and artistic sophistication. The Greeks remembered that the Cretans had been master builders and craftsmen, so they created a mythical genius to explain the marvelous palaces. The story of Daedalus and his son Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wings of feathers and wax, might preserve a memory of Minoan maritime power. Flying over the sea, reaching too high, and falling to doom. It's a mythological explanation for Minoan collapse, hubris punished by the gods. King Minos himself is interesting. In Greek mythology, he's portrayed both positively and negatively. Sometimes he's a wise lawgiver who becomes a judge in the underworld after death. Sometimes he's a tyrant who demands cruel tributes. This dual portrayal might reflect different periods, the wise lawgiver representing Minoan prosperity, the tyrant representing later Mycenaean-era decline. There's also the myth of Europa, whom Zeus, disguised as a bull, abducted and carried to Crete, where she became the mother of Minos. This might preserve a memory of Minoan cultural connections to the Near East. Europa comes from Phoenicia, connecting Cretan civilization to broader Mediterranean networks. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BC, mentions that Minos ruled a sea empire and cleared the Mediterranean of pirates. He's uncertain if it's true. By his time, the Minoans had been forgotten for over 700 years. But he's preserving a historical memory of Cretan maritime dominance, even if details are lost. Greek mythology is full of Cretan references. Zeus was supposedly born in a cave on Crete and raised there. The first Olympic Games, according to myth, were held on Crete. These myths suggest that classical Greeks had a dim awareness that Crete had once been extremely important, even if they didn't understand why. The myths also preserve social details. Pasiphae's association with bulls reflects Minoan bull worship. Ariadne, as a princess helping a foreign hero, might reflect intermarriage between Cretan and mainland Greek elites. Daedalus, crafting technological marvels, reflects Minoan advanced architecture and engineering. But the myths also distort and obscure. The sophisticated, peaceful, artistic Minoan civilization gets transformed into a dark story about monsters and human sacrifice. Minoan cultural achievements get attributed to legendary individuals rather than a whole society. Historical reality gets filtered through cultural biases and centuries of oral transmission. This is how cultural memory works when writing is lost. Stories survive, but they change. Historical events become legend.
Real people become mythical heroes or villains. Details blur, contradict, multiply. What emerges is truth wrapped in fiction, history preserved, but transformed. The irony is that by creating these myths, the Greeks kept Minoan memory alive. Distorted, yes. Transformed into monsters and mazes, yes. But alive. For 3,000 years, when nobody knew the Minoans really existed, the Minotaur kept their memory alive. The myths were a thread, like Ariadne's thread, connecting the present to a forgotten past. When Arthur Evans excavated Knossos, he was partly inspired by Greek myths. He was looking for Minos' palace, for the labyrinth, for the truth behind the legends, and he found it. The myths had preserved enough truth to guide him to real history. The Minotaur led him to the Minoans.
This pattern repeats throughout archaeology. Heinrich Schliemann found Troy by following Homer's Iliad. Historical myths, even when exaggerated or distorted, often contain kernels of truth. The Minoans are perhaps the best example, a real civilization hidden inside a monster story, waiting to be rediscovered. We need to address the elephant, or rather the sunken island, in the room. Ever since Minoan civilization was rediscovered, people have been asking, is this Atlantis? Could the Minoans be Plato's legendary lost civilization? It's one of the most persistent theories in archaeology, and while most scholars are skeptical, it's worth examining seriously. First, what did Plato actually say? Writing around 360 BC in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato described Atlantis as a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. It was wealthy, technologically advanced, and controlled a maritime empire. But the Atlanteans became corrupt and aggressive, trying to conquer other nations. The gods punished them. In a single day and night of disasters, Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the waves. The Minoan-Atlantis connection seems obvious at first glance. Atlantis was an island civilization. Check. Crete is an island. Atlantis controlled a maritime empire. Check. The Minoans dominated Mediterranean sea trade. Atlantis was advanced and wealthy. Check. Minoan palaces show sophisticated technology and great wealth. Atlantis was destroyed by natural disaster. Check. The Thera eruption and tsunami devastated Crete. The parallels are striking. Atlantis had hot and cold running water. So did the Minoans. Atlantis had bull ceremonies. So did the Minoans. Atlantis was peaceful, but eventually conquered. That fits Minoan history. Even Atlantis supposedly sinking beneath the waves could be a garbled memory of the tsunami destroying coastal Minoan settlements. Some serious scholars have suggested the connection. Archaeologist J.V. Luce argued that Plato's story drew on Egyptian records, preserving distorted memories of Minoan Crete and the Thera eruption. The Greeks called the Minoans Keftiu, and Egypt traded extensively with Crete. Egyptian priests might have told stories about the great island civilization destroyed by catastrophe. But there are major problems with this theory. Plato said Atlantis existed 9,000 years before his time. That would be around 9,360 BC, way before any Mediterranean civilization existed. The Minoans flourished around 2000 to 1450 BC. That's a 7,000-year discrepancy. Defenders argue Plato, or his Egyptian sources, got the date wrong. Maybe it was 900 years before, not 9,000, a simple transcription error. That would put it around 1260 BC, close to the Mycenaean period on Crete. It's possible, but it requires assuming ancient sources made a huge numerical error. Plato also says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, past Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. Crete is in the Mediterranean, nowhere near the Atlantic. The name Atlantic itself comes from Atlantis, not the other way around. Plato specifically locates Atlantis in the ocean that bears its name. Plato also describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined, basically continent-sized. Crete is 3,200 square miles, about the size of Puerto Rico. It's not remotely continent-sized. You can't hand-wave that discrepancy away easily. Most scholars think Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical thought experiment. He was writing philosophy, not history. Atlantis was a fictional example he created to make points about political systems and moral corruption. Maybe he borrowed details from various real civilizations, Egypt, Carthage, Sicily, and yes, possibly, garbled stories about Crete. But that doesn't make the Minoans literally Atlantis. However, the public imagination loves the Atlantis-Minoa connection. Every documentary about the Minoans mentions Atlantis. Every book cover hints at it. It's catnip for people who love mysteries and lost civilizations. And honestly, the real Minoan story is pretty Atlantis-like, even without claiming direct connection. Modern science has added new dimensions to the mystery. DNA studies show the Minoans were native Aegean people, related to other Bronze Age populations from Greece and Anatolia. They weren't mysterious refugees from some distant land. They were locals who developed an advanced civilization through innovation and trade. Ground-penetrating radar and other technologies keep finding new structures beneath the ground around Knossos. Each discovery adds to our knowledge, but also raises new questions. What else is buried? What are we still missing? The Minoans are still revealing their secrets. Climate science has reconstructed the Thera eruption in detail. We know it ejected at least 40 cubic kilometers of material. We know it caused tsunamis that would have devastated Crete. We know it affected global climate. The science confirms that this was a civilization-ending catastrophe, whether you call it Atlantis or not. Underwater archaeology has explored the seafloor around Thera and Crete, finding Bronze Age settlements now underwater. Sea levels were lower in Minoan times, so coastal settlements are now submerged. These underwater ruins fuel Atlantis speculation. Here are literally sunken cities from the right time period. But these settlements weren't swallowed by the sea in a day. Sea levels rose gradually over millennia after the Bronze Age, slowly submerging coastal areas. It's not the dramatic overnight sinking Plato described. It's slow geological process, not divine punishment. The real question isn't, were the Minoans Atlantis? The real question is, why do we want them to be Atlantis? What psychological need does this connection fulfill? We want to believe that Plato wasn't just making stuff up, that his story had some historical basis. We want to believe that advanced civilizations existed in deep antiquity. We want to believe there are still mysteries, still discoveries to be made, still lost worlds waiting to be found. And here's the beautiful thing. All of that is true, even without Atlantis. The Minoans were an advanced civilization in deep antiquity. They were lost and forgotten. They are mysterious. We are still making discoveries. The real story is as compelling as any legend. Maybe that's the lesson. Reality doesn't need mythology to be interesting. The truth about the Minoans, what they actually achieved, how they actually lived, what actually destroyed them, is more fascinating than any legendary Atlantis could be. The Minoans were real people who built an extraordinary civilization. They created beauty, developed technology, established trade networks, and thrived for centuries. Then natural disaster and human conquest destroyed them, so thoroughly that they vanished from history. That's already an incredible story. We don't need to make them Atlantis. They're amazing enough on their own.
But the Atlantis question will probably never die completely. And maybe that's okay. The speculation drives interest, which drives research, which leads to discoveries. If believing in Atlantis gets people interested in Bronze Age archaeology, that's not such a bad thing. As long as we keep fact and fiction separate, as long as we follow evidence rather than fantasy, a little mystery doesn't hurt. The Minoans would probably be amused by all this. They built a real civilization, achieved real things, and we're arguing about whether they match a fictional story. But they'd also be gratified that 3,500 years after their civilization fell, people still care enough to debate, to dig, to try to understand who they were and what happened to them. That's a kind of immortality. So here we are at the end of the story. The Minoans are gone, their civilization destroyed, their language dead, their culture absorbed and forgotten. But they left us something. Let's talk about what they gave the world, what lessons their rise and fall teach us, and why they still matter 3,500 years after the last Minoan palace burned. First, the tangible legacy. The Minoans influenced Greek civilization profoundly, even though the classical Greeks barely remembered them. Artistic styles, architectural techniques, religious practices, all passed from Minoans through Mycenaeans to the Greeks who came after. When you look at Greek pottery, Greek temples, Greek myths, you're seeing Minoan echoes. The writing system connects directly to us. Linear B, which the Mycenaeans adapted from Linear A, influenced later Greek alphabets. The Greek alphabet influenced Latin. Latin influenced all European alphabets, including English. Every letter you're reading traces back, in some convoluted way, to Minoan scribes pressing styluses into clay tablets. Our writing is their descendant. Greek mythology absorbed Minoan elements. Zeus, born on Crete, the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, King Minos as judge of the dead. These stories preserve Minoan cultural memory. The peaceful, nature-loving aspects of Greek religion probably come from Minoan influence. The connection between Greek and Near Eastern cultures ran through Crete as intermediary. But beyond specific influences, the Minoans demonstrated something crucial. You can build a great civilization through trade rather than conquest. You can prosper through cooperation rather than warfare. You don't need to be militaristic to be powerful. This is an important lesson that the world keeps forgetting and relearning. The Minoan paradox is that their peaceful nature was both strength and weakness. It allowed them to build a sophisticated, wealthy, culturally rich society. But it left them vulnerable when disaster struck and more aggressive neighbors saw opportunity. There's a lesson there about the balance between idealism and pragmatism, between peace and the capacity for self-defense. The Minoans also teach us about fragility. They were advanced, wealthy, powerful, and in just a few decades, they were gone. Being sophisticated doesn't guarantee survival. Being rich doesn't guarantee survival. When catastrophe hits, whether natural or human-made, civilizations can collapse surprisingly quickly. The Bronze Age collapse that finished what the volcanic eruption started shows how interconnected systems can fail catastrophically. The Minoans depended on Mediterranean-wide trade networks. When those networks collapsed, their economy couldn't function. Being connected and specialized made them powerful, but vulnerable. That's deeply relevant today, when our civilization is far more interconnected than the Minoans ever were. Climate change destroyed or severely damaged Minoan civilization. The volcanic eruption altered climate. Crop failures followed. Economic collapse, social unrest, vulnerability to conquest.
all triggered by environmental catastrophe beyond human control. Sound familiar? We face climate change now on a much larger scale, and we're not adapting well. The Minoans also teach us about cultural memory, what survives and what doesn't. They left us palaces, pottery, tablets, beautiful art. They left us material culture that still inspires awe. But they didn't leave us their literature, their history, their personal stories, their philosophies. Everything on perishable materials is gone. Everything transmitted orally died when the culture died. We think our digital age preserves everything, but digital storage is incredibly fragile. Hard drives fail. File formats become obsolete. Cloud servers require electricity and maintenance. If civilization collapsed tomorrow, what would survive for future archaeologists? Maybe less than we think. The Minoans left baked clay tablets. We're leaving data that requires advanced technology to access. Which is more durable? The biggest lesson is humility. The Minoans built Europe's first civilization. They thought they'd last forever. Nobody builds palaces like Knossos if they think it's temporary. They were wrong. Every civilization thinks it's permanent. Rome thought it was eternal. The British Empire thought the sun would never set on it. Everyone thinks they're the exception. Nobody is. Today, millions of tourists visit Crete annually. They walk through Knossos, photograph the frescoes, marvel at the ancient columns. The palace has become a monument to lost glory, a reminder that even the mighty fall. It's beautiful and melancholy at the same time. Preserving what remains is challenging. Knossos is made of limestone and gypsum, materials that erode easily. The frescoes fade with exposure to light and air. Climate change is accelerating decay. Increased rainfall erodes structures, higher temperatures stress materials. We're racing against time to preserve what's left. This creates bitter irony. The Minoans disappeared and were forgotten for 3,500 years. Now that we've rediscovered them, we're fighting to keep them from disappearing again. We value what they created, understand its importance, desperately want to preserve it. But time and nature don't care about human desires. The Minoans would probably be amazed that we remember them at all. They couldn't have imagined that 3,500 years after their civilization fell, people from around the world would travel to see their palaces, study their writing, argue about their history. They've achieved immortality. Not physical immortality, but cultural immortality through memory and scholarship. And that's perhaps the final lesson. What we create outlasts us. The Minoans are gone, but their art remains. Their buildings, even as ruins, endure. The beauty they created persists long after the people who created it have turned to dust. If we want to be remembered, we should create things worth remembering. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about the Minoans. Think about those ancient people on their island paradise. Think about them building palaces without walls, leaping over sacred bowls, sailing to distant lands, creating beauty for its own sake. Think about how they lived, how they prospered, how they fell. Think about what they left behind, the ruins, the art, the mysteries, the lessons. They spoke to us across 3,500 years of silence, and we heard them. Their palaces are ruins now. Their language is dead. Their culture is gone. But we remember them. We study them. We learn from them.
We're moved by their achievements and saddened by their fall. Remember, nothing lasts forever. No civilization is permanent. No empire is eternal. But the good we create, the beauty we make, the knowledge we preserve, these can outlast empires. The Minoans proved that. Their empire died, but their legacy lives on. That's immortality. That's hope. That's the gift they gave us. Sleep well, knowing that civilizations rise and fall like tides, but human creativity, human courage, human beauty endure. The Minoans taught us that, and we'll remember them for it. Their story is over, but their memory lives on. They're gone, but not forgotten. And maybe that's the best ending any civilization can hope for. Good night. And remember the Minoans.